Margaret adjusted the lace curtain on the window, watching as the world outside transformed into a frozen postcard. The wind howled, carrying snowflakes that piled up in the garden below. The bare tree in front of the house stood like a somber guardian, unmoving against the storm. Winter in Maine was like that, relentless and silent, especially for someone like Margaret, whose life had dwindled to simple routines and days that seemed to drag on endlessly. The house was small but cozy, adorned with touches she had lovingly added for Christmas. The tree in the corner of the living room wasn't large, but it was decorated with handmade ornaments that held decades of memories. There was a paper angel her eldest son, Peter, had made in school when he was 8, now yellowed with age. The string lights blinked sporadically, as if battling against the cold creeping into the house. Stockings hung by the fireplace, a tradition Margaret couldn't bring herself to abandon, even though there was no one to fill them. It had been 5 years since James, her husband, had passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack. Since then, Margaret had grown accustomed to solitude. It wasn't something she had chosen, but rather something she had come to accept. Her children, Peter and Laura, lived busy lives, each on opposite coasts of the country. Phone calls were increasingly rare, and when they did happen, they were filled with polite excuses. "Oh, Mom, work is crazy," or "the kids have so many activities." Margaret always replied with a tone of understanding, though her heart ached every time she hung up. On this Christmas Eve, she tried to keep her spirits high. She lit the last candle on the nativity scene, the one she and James had bought at a Christmas fair early in their marriage. Each piece, the baby Jesus, Mary, Joseph, the shepherds, felt laden with meaning. It was a small gesture, but it gave Margaret a sense of continuity, a feeling that something in her life remained unchanged. Suddenly the silence of the house was broken by a knock at the door. Margaret turned quickly, her heart racing. Who could it be? Pushing aside thoughts that it might just be her imagination, she walked to the door. Outside the wind howled and snow fell thickly. When she opened the door, she was met with a desolate scene. No one was there. Only the cold air rushed in, along with a small package placed carefully on the step. The package was wrapped in golden paper that gleamed under the faint glow of the porch light. Curious, Margaret picked it up, feeling its weight in her hands. It wasn't heavy, but it seemed to hold something significant. Closing the door carefully behind her, she returned to her armchair by the fireplace, studying the package as if it were a puzzle she needed to solve. When she unwrapped it, she found a simple card inside. There was no sender, no postage stamp, only a message written in elegant handwriting. "Miracles happen for those who believe." Margaret read the words over and over, trying to understand their meaning. Was this some kind of joke, or perhaps a kind gesture from a neighbor? The evening wore on with Margaret deep in thought. Something about the message stirred her in a profound way, awakening memories and emotions she had buried over the years. The decorations, the scent of the lit candle, the faint sound of Christmas bells ringing from the neighborhood church, all seemed to align, bringing forth an emotion she had forgotten. Tears welled up in her eyes as she held the card, unsure of who had sent it, but already feeling that it was more than just a simple gift. The mystery of that package began to occupy Margaret's thoughts. She knew her life had settled into a predictable and lonely routine. But now, something had shifted. Something, or someone, seemed determined to remind her that miracles were still possible, even for an elderly woman living alone in a small town. As the clock approached midnight, Margaret placed the card on the table beside her armchair and looked again at the nativity scene. She whispered, as if speaking to herself or to someone unseen. Could it really be? Could miracles still happen? The next day, Margaret found herself lost in thought, unable to shake the mysterious package from her mind. The phrase on the card, "Miracles happen for those who believe," echoed within her, stirring memories and emotions she had tried to bury since James's death. While retrieving the newspaper from her porch, her gaze wandered through the neighborhood. Who could have left that gift? There were no obvious clues, and the mystery sparked a curiosity Margaret hadn't felt in years. Her morning routine involved making a cup of tea and feeding the neighbor's cat, a ginger tabby named Oliver, who spent more time at her house than with his owner. Sitting at the kitchen table, Margaret flipped through the newspaper, but no headline held her attention. It was as if her mind had tuned into another channel, replaying scenes from a past that suddenly felt nearer than before. Margaret had always loved Christmas. It was a time when she and James made a point of filling their home with life. James had a contagious laugh, and they often hosted community dinners for neighbors and friends, especially those with nowhere else to go. But after his death, the tradition faded. The celebrations became empty, much like the house itself. As she mentally revisited past Christmases, Margaret remembered a promise she and James had made to each other: to help someone in need every Christmas as a way of giving back for the blessings they'd received. It was a tradition that began during their first year of marriage, when they'd discovered a neighboring family struggling to make ends meet. That year, they had anonymously delivered food and gifts to the family's doorstep, along with a message of hope. The memory was vivid yet painful. Since James's death, Margaret had neglected that tradition, consumed by her grief. But now the package felt like a gentle reminder, or perhaps an invitation, to rekindle that forgotten promise. Determined to find answers, Margaret realized she couldn't simply ignore the gift. She bundled up in her heavy coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and stepped outside to investigate. The snow had stopped, but the cold was biting. She began walking through the neighborhood, observing the houses and trying to imagine who might have left the package. Could it have been the mail carrier? Or perhaps someone from church? The questions swirled in her mind as quickly as the icy wind stung her cheeks. Her first stop was at Emma's house, an elderly neighbor who attended the same church. Emma was kind and always full of stories, but when asked about the package, she shook her head. "Oh, Margaret, who knows? It could be someone trying to spread a little joy. We all need that, especially this time of year," Emma said with a warm smile. Margaret nodded, grateful for the conversation, but no closer to uncovering the mystery. As she walked back home, Emma's words lingered in her mind. "We all need joy, especially at Christmas." Back in her cozy living room, Margaret sat once more by the fireplace, holding the card in her hands. She still didn't know who had left the package, but the message it carried had already begun to stir something within her. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to start believing in miracles again. As Margaret walked back home, something nagged at her. The idea that the package was simply an anonymous gesture didn't feel sufficient. There was something more, something she couldn't quite grasp. However, her walk brought another unexpected discovery. While opening one of the decoration boxes still in the garage, she found an old letter from James, tucked among the ornaments. James's handwriting was unmistakable, and Margaret's heart clenched at the sight of her name on the envelope. With trembling hands, she opened the letter. It was a simple but heartfelt message, written during one of their last Christmases together. In it, James reflected on how much the holiday meant to him because of the people they were able to help. He specifically mentioned a family on their street that had been struggling at the time. Margaret, never forget, the true spirit of Christmas is in giving, even when we feel we don't have much to offer. Promise me that we'll always find a way to help someone, especially during this season. The world needs kindness, and we can be the spark that ignites it. Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she read. That letter seemed to have resurfaced at the perfect time, as if James were trying to remind her of something she had lost sight of. The mention of the struggling family made her wonder, could there be someone in her neighborhood now who needed help? Throughout the day, Margaret pondered what she should do. The mysterious package felt like more than a gift. It felt like a call to action, and for the first time in years, she felt she might have a greater purpose than just passing her days alone in her small house. What she didn't yet realize was that following the instinct sparked by that gift would lead her life in an entirely unexpected direction. Margaret woke up the next morning determined to act. The mysterious present, the message on the card, and James's letter seemed like pieces of a puzzle she was meant to solve. There was something powerful in the sequence of events, as though destiny were sending her a clear signal. It was time to break free from her bubble of isolation and rediscover the Christmas spirit that had once been so meaningful to her and James. After breakfast, she put on her warmest coat, laced up sturdy boots, and ventured out with a simple plan: to find someone in the neighborhood who might need help. Her steps took her to the home of Sarah, a young single mother who lived 2 streets over. Margaret only knew her by sight, but had always noticed that the house seemed a little neglected, as if there weren't enough resources or time to care for it. The path to the front door was slippery, covered in hardened snow, and the Christmas lights blinked irregularly, with a few already burned out. When Margaret knocked, she heard children's voices inside and the hurried sound of footsteps. Sarah opened the door, looking curious and tired, holding her youngest child, a boy of about 2, in her arms. Her older daughter, an 8-year-old clutching a well-worn teddy bear, peeked shyly from behind her mother's legs. "Hello, Sarah. I'm Margaret. I live nearby," she began, her smile warm. "I was thinking, well, with Christmas coming, maybe I could help out in some way. I know things can be a bit challenging sometimes." Sarah hesitated, clearly surprised by the unexpected visit. Her expression flickered between caution and gratitude. "Oh, thank you, but we're fine," she replied, her tone slightly defensive. "The kids have everything they need." Margaret heard the pride in Sarah's voice and decided not to press the issue, at least not yet. Instead, she softened her approach. "I understand, but, Christmas has always been special for me and my husband. We used to do little things to make the season brighter for others. Maybe I could bring some cookies by later, if you don't mind." Sarah gave a hesitant smile and nodded. "That would be nice. The kids love cookies." Back at home, Margaret felt a mix of frustration and excitement. There was something about Sarah that reminded her of herself during the early years of her marriage, when financial struggles made Christmas a challenging time. She didn't want to simply offer help. She wanted to do something meaningful, something that could truly touch that family's life. As she baked the cookies, an idea began to take shape. What if there were other families in the neighborhood who also needed help? What if that mysterious package was a call for something bigger, something that could bring the community together? Margaret's mind raced as she imagined what could be possible. A community effort, perhaps, an initiative to bring hope to those in need, just as she and James had done in their younger days. The thought filled her with a renewed sense of purpose and a spark of excitement she hadn't felt in years. By the time the cookies were cooling on the counter, Margaret had made up her mind. She wasn't going to stop with Sarah. This Christmas, she would reignite the tradition she and James had cherished, starting with the families around her. For the first time in what felt like forever, Margaret felt truly alive, as though she were part of something larger than herself. Margaret decided to dig deeper. She spoke with Emma again, and then with the mail carrier, who confirmed having seen similar packages delivered to other houses in the neighborhood. "It's funny," the mail carrier said, adjusting his cap against the icy wind. "It seems like someone's trying to spread the Christmas spirit. I don't know who it is, but it's a lovely idea." Intrigued, Margaret began visiting other houses, using the excuse of delivering the cookies she had baked and wishing everyone a Merry Christmas. In each conversation, she uncovered small details about her neighbors. Mr. Anderson, a widower who hadn't left his house since the pandemic began. the Martinez family struggling to pay bills after the father lost his job, and of course, Sarah juggling work and the care of her young children. Yet her offers of help often met resistance. Many neighbors, like Sarah, hesitated to accept direct assistance. The distrust seemed like a reflection of today's world, where even the simplest gestures were often questioned. Margaret felt the weight of this reluctance, but something inside her pushed her to keep going. At the same time, the mystery of the original package lingered. Who was sending those anonymous messages, and why? Margaret realized she needed to think beyond individual acts of kindness. Inspired by James's words in the letter, she began planning something that could bring everyone together, a community Christmas dinner. The idea was ambitious, especially since it had been years since anyone in the neighborhood had organized something similar. But Margaret believed that the magic of Christmas was about precisely that, bringing people together who might otherwise be alone or struggling. With her limited resources, she got to work. She spent hours decorating the small community hall at the church, gathering food donations and inviting every neighbor, especially those who seemed the most hesitant. The plan wasn't without its challenges. Some neighbors declined the invitations, saying they already had plans or simply weren't interested. Others, like Sarah, remained ambivalent and gave no clear answer about whether they'd attend. Margaret wrestled with internal doubts, questioning whether her efforts were worth it. Yet every time she thought of giving up, the words on the card and James's letter echoed in her mind. Miracles happen for those who believe. On Christmas Eve, Margaret finished the preparations alone in the hall, her heart filled with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. The space was simple but welcoming, with decorated tables, twinkling lights, and a play area set aside for children. She hung James's letter on a board near the entrance, feeling a bittersweet mix of sadness and gratitude. It was as if he was still there, guiding her every step. The dinner was her last attempt to rekindle the Christmas spirit, not just for herself, but for the entire neighborhood. Now, it all depended on who would show up, if anyone did. At 7 p.m., Margaret lit the last of the candles on the tables. The flickering glow illuminated the modestly decorated hall, antique ceramic plates borrowed from the church, linen tablecloths she had found in a cupboard, and small pine arrangements tied with red ribbons. Despite all the preparation, the hall was empty, and the silence seemed to mock her efforts. Margaret glanced at the board where James's letter was displayed. His words, written so many years ago, still felt alive. The true spirit of Christmas is in giving, even when we feel we don't have much to offer. Taking a deep breath, she decided to wait a little longer, holding on to a stubborn hope that someone would come. Minutes passed, and the faint sound of footsteps crunching on snow caught her attention. The first to arrive was Sarah, holding her eldest daughter's hand and carrying her youngest in her arms. The little girl held out a plate covered in foil, offering it shyly to Margaret. "We brought cookies," Sarah said with a hesitant smile. Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest as she helped the young mother settle in. Soon after, more people began to arrive. Mr. Anderson, who had been reclusive for years, showed up with a cane, thanking Margaret for giving him a reason to leave the house. Emma brought a dish of mashed potatoes, and along with her, two neighbors Margaret barely knew. The Martinez family arrived carrying a traditional dish that filled the hall with a comforting aroma. As the hall filled, laughter and voices began to echo, melting away the chill Margaret had felt over the past weeks. What started as a small gathering turned into a lively celebration. Children played in the designated area, their laughter weaving through the conversations of adults who hadn't spoken to one another in years. Margaret moved between tables, ensuring everyone was comfortable, her heart swelling as she saw strangers becoming friends. By the end of the evening, the warmth in the room wasn't just from the food or the candles, it was the unmistakable warmth of connection. The barriers that had seemed insurmountable just days ago had begun to crumble, replaced by something deeper, a shared sense of community. Margaret looked around the room, her eyes welling with tears. The dinner had become more than she could have imagined, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could spark something extraordinary. As she watched the neighbors laughing and sharing stories, she realized that the true miracle wasn't just in the gathering itself, but in the renewed belief that even in the coldest winters of life, the spirit of Christmas could bring light and warmth. For many in the room, it was the first Christmas in years they wouldn't spend alone. Children ran around the hall, their laughter lighting up the space more than any decoration ever could. Adults shared stories, and conversations flowed with a magical ease. Margaret watched from a distance, a serene smile on her face. With every dish served and every smile exchanged, she felt the weight of years of loneliness lift from her shoulders. The most poignant moment of the evening came when Sarah stood up to speak. Her eyes glistened with tears as she thanked Margaret for her persistence, even when Sarah herself had hesitated to accept help. "I've felt so lost, so alone. But tonight, I've realized there's still kindness in the world, and that means everything to me and my kids." Sarah's words touched everyone in the room. Margaret felt tears stream down her face as the young mother spoke. This was exactly what she and James had always dreamed of, using Christmas to bring hope and warmth to others. As the dinner drew to a close, an unexpected surprise unfolded. A young man, about 20 years old, approached Margaret with an embarrassed smile. In his hands was an envelope similar to the one Margaret had found at her door. "I'm the one who left the package on your doorstep," he confessed. "It was something my mom used to do when I was a kid. She told me she learned it from a couple in the neighborhood years ago. Their names were James and Margaret." Margaret was speechless, overcome with a mix of emotion and disbelief. She and James had inspired a tradition that had now come full circle, returning to her like a quiet echo of kindness. The young man continued, "I thought it might be time to bring the tradition back. Looks like it worked." The entire hall fell silent for a moment, absorbing the depth of his revelation. Margaret, tears in her eyes, held the young man's hand and thanked him. "You have no idea how much this means to me. James would be so proud." By the end of the night, the hall was filled with joy and gratitude. Neighbors said their goodbyes with hugs, promising to stay in touch and carry the tradition forward in the years to come. Margaret stayed behind, tidying up the last of the dishes and blowing out the candles. The silence that followed wasn't the oppressive loneliness she had known, but a comforting stillness, rich with meaning. Back at home, Margaret sat by the fireplace, holding James's letter in one hand and the card from the mysterious package in the other. For the first time in many years, she felt the emptiness inside her begin to fill. It wasn't just because of the companionship of the evening, but the certainty that her kindness and James's had left a lasting mark on the world. Before heading to bed, Margaret glanced at the illuminated nativity scene. A deep sense of peace washed over her as she murmured, as though speaking to James, "Miracles really do happen, my love, and somehow you're still here, guiding me." Margaret ended that Christmas with a renewed heart. It wasn't just a night of celebration, but the start of something much greater, a community rebuilt, hearts reopened, and a promise that miracles can indeed happen when people have the faith and courage to believe.